Okay, so this is David Cameron's last day in office. In fact, last hour, literally. In about 1 hour, he will meet Queen and formally tender his resignation. And about half an hour or so later, Theresa May will arrive at the palace to formally request the formation of a government. This is done in the context of outside the general election, so it's ascension to power rather than through winning a general election. But I'm going to speak more about Theresa May and what she faces later on. For this video, I want to focus on David Cameron, the man who has led this country for the past 6 years. And I'm going to break it down into a little bit of biography and background, his international politics legacy, and his domestic politics legacy. This is going to be very abbreviated, very summarized, and I'm not going to say entirely neutral. There is going to be opinions within this video. I have my opinions and I'm going to voice some of those, but I'm going to try and make it fair and balanced. So, without further ado, David Donald Cameron, was born in London in 1966. He is a distant relative of King William IV, so by extension, he is a distant cousin of Queen Elizabeth II. He attended Eton and Oxford University, and within Oxford, he was associated with the Bullingdon Society, along with other high rising conservative figures, including George Osborne and Boris Johnson. In 2005, after 4 years as an MP, he became leader of the Conservative Party. In 2010, he became Prime Minister. This is one of the fastest ascensions to number 10 from becoming a newly elected MP ever. His background before becoming an MP was that he was a sort of intern speechwriter and advisor to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, in the Major government. So, although he was elected in 2001, he had some political experience before that. On his election in 2010, David Cameron, at 43, was the youngest Prime Minister in 200 years since Lord Liverpool in 1812. He was a bit younger than Tony Blair, so he beat that record. Um, he came in exceptional circumstances. In the general election of that year, although the Tories had been out of government for 13 years, they didn't get enough to win an overall majority. So, very unusually in this country, we eventually formed a coalition government after 5 days of frantic talks between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. Now, at that point, no one knew exactly what was going to happen. The Conservatives were the biggest party, but the Lib Dems could have went either way. They could have went to Gordon Brown's Labour. But in the end, Nick Clegg and David Cameron were far more similar in personality and background. So, this video could very much be called the Cameron Clegg years because Nick Clegg formed 5/6 of the Cameron government. Um, the Liberal Democrats were the junior partner in that government. Immediately, this became known as the austerity government. But I'll come on to more domestic policies in a minute. On the international stage, Cameron has continued the liberal interventionism of Tony Blair, although perhaps a little more cautious. We have ended combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but got involved in a contentious war in Libya. That was in the context of Colonel Gaddafi brutally massacring civilians, and there was, at the time, Libyan pleads for Western help. When Nicolas Sarkozy and David Cameron arrived in Benghazi, they were hailed as liberators. Since then, of course, Libya has essentially become a failed state. So, as with a lot of aspects of this video, that is going to be for very long debate. Um, on Syria, in 2012, Cameron tried to push for action against the Assad regime, especially coming on top of actually 2013, especially coming on top of the brutal Ghouta massacre, which was blamed on Assad's forces. China and Russia blocked any UN action, they vetoed any UN action. More recently, the focus has been on the rise of ISIS. One of the major domestic problems, which ties with international issues, is the increasing radicalization of young British Muslims. And we've had literally hundreds of recruits going to join ISIS. So this has been one of the major challenges of the Cameron administration. Um, we have continued strong relations with America, the special relationship, but unlike Tony Blair, Cameron has been very careful not to look subservient. Um, Overall, I would say relations with Obama have been good, not perfect, but good overall. There has been a few testing moments. For example, in the aftermath of Libya. It has to be said that on the international stage, this has been a very turbulent period with the Arabian Spring and subsequent Arabian Winter. Um, Relations with Russia have been very, very tense, but that is something that is consistent with other Western countries. There has been the fallout over Ukraine, over the basically new Cold War games between East and West, and Britain has been very central to this. So that has perhaps been a more questionable part of the legacy, depending on your viewpoint. Um, Cameron has been very keen to focus on being a country and a prime minister that is looking at the shortcomings of this country on the international stage. In other words, Britain's perception. So one thing that he has done is apologise, both in India and Ireland, two countries very strongly influenced by the British Empire, for imperial wrongs in both those countries. In Ireland, he apologised for the Croke Park massacre and Bloody Sunday. In India, he apologised for the Amritsar massacre on a state visit to that country. So this has been a hallmark of the Cameron administration trying to bolster Britain's international image. Um, we have got very close relationships with China, arguably closer than any other Western country. And Sino-Anglo relations have been described as a golden age or a golden era. That has been somewhat contentious because there has been a perception in Britain that this has been at the price of selling our values on such issues as human rights. In other words, we get multi-billion pound trade with the Chinese in exchange for basically keeping quiet on those very contentious issues. So Xi Jinping made a very high-profile state visit last year. We have also sought to be closer to India and other emerging markets. Brexit, of course, is one of the major issues of the Cameron administration. People will say he made a major mistake in calling for a referendum, but to be fair, this is exactly what he said he would do. So those who are vilifying and criticising Cameron should perhaps reflect on the fact that this is a prime minister who said he would call the referendum and did, whereas previous prime ministers didn't. So surely that in itself is to his credit. Of course, the outcome will take years to really determine whether it was the right or wrong decision. I voted Remain. Mr. Cameron himself was for Remain. He was disappointed, and that, of course, prompted the resignation. Um, on the world stage, I don't think Cameron would stand out as much as figures like Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair, but he has nevertheless been probably an above average prime minister. Now, looking at domestic policies, that's obviously a big area that I want to touch on. Cameron always modelled himself as a liberal conservative, and he never actually liked the term Tory. If you want to know a bit about Cameron's philosophy, this is a very interesting read. In many ways, he very much tapped into the image sort of politics of Tony Blair. This book, Cameron on Cameron, is actually in the format of interviews with Dylan Jones. It's a very interesting read. It was published before he became Prime Minister, but it really shows the man's philosophy. Um, he's a very confident and, unlike Gordon Brown, a very media savvy Prime Minister. So, in this sense, he has been called the heir to Blair, and you can see where that comes from. Um, so he's been very keen to present himself as a modern liberal conservative or one nation Tory. That, however, has been dubious. One of the big hallmarks of the Cameron administration has been the promotion, especially in the early years, of the concept of a big society. The problem is, in 2010-11 especially, this country was bitterly divided, and the government's very harsh austerity cuts has not helped. They've hit public sector services very hard, and arguably the wealth poverty divide in this country has got greater. Of course, that's something politicians are going to debate, but there's no question about it. There has been some hallmarks of the Cameron legacy that has caused great suffering in this country, especially in terms of welfare, for example, work capability assessments. Um, food stamps, food banks is going to be definitely one of the more negative legacies. And as Jeremy Corbyn said today, homelessness has increased. To what extent as comparable to previous governments is to be debated. But as a hallmark of some of the tensions that were going on, there were huge anti-government demonstrations. One of the first big challenges was over tuition fees, although that was more direct towards Nick Clegg and his implied false promises on that. But there has also been strikes on such issues as junior doctors, among many other sectors. If I mitigate anything in this video, if I leave anything out, it's not deliberate. It's simply that this has been a very eventful 6 years. There has been other things going on that are not necessarily directly connected to the Prime Minister that have been eventful. The Queen's Diamond Jubilee, where she celebrated 60 years on the throne, the royal wedding in 2011. In fact, that year 2011 has often been compared to 1981. In both 1981 and 2011, there was an unpopular Conservative government, bearing in mind the Tories were a minority government at that time. There was a royal wedding in both years, and inner city riots broke out in 2011. Now, the hard left have sort of used this to vindicate their views against austerity. But to be fair, I think a lot of that was opportunistic violence. It was 4 days of mayhem, basically. Serious rioting in London, Birmingham, Manchester, and numerous other big cities across England. I was going to say across the UK, but specifically across England. Um, so, in terms of austerity, Cameron and Osborne will collectively be known as the austerity leaders, and that is something that is definitely going to be very deeply controversial for years to come. Um, and I don't suspect May will change that very radically, but time will tell. On other issues, those social issues, Cameron has demonstrated he's been on the liberal side of things. For example, he is the prime minister who has brought in gay marriage, and as he said today, 33,000 gay couples can say that he changed history in that regard. He didn't say those exact words, but it's along those lines. Um, Peace in Northern Ireland has continued. It has overall been a very positive period for Northern Ireland. Overall, notwithstanding the faction that still exists, but I don't think anyone could dispute that relations between Ireland and Britain have greatly improved, and the situation in Northern Ireland itself has greatly improved. Although both John Major and Tony Blair deserve some credit for that as well. Um, One of the major issues on the domestic front has been the Scottish referendum. That was bitterly divisive, and it was a very worrying time for those of us who passionately believe in the Union. Now, David Cameron, with both the Scottish referendum and the Brexit, can either be seen as a modern day Lord North or a modern day Neville Chamberlain. With the Scottish referendum, there's two ways to look at it. On one hand, you can consider this is the Prime Minister that saw the country almost broken up. On the other hand, the country didn't break up, and the Scottish people chose to stay in the Union. So, on his watch, the Union stayed together. Though I don't think it would be quite accurate to say that David Cameron personally saved the Union. I think Gordon Brown played a very big role in that, as did other Better Together campaigners like Alistair Darling, among many others. But that was a major constitutional issue. So there's a lot of things there. On a personal level, I will say a few personal notes. David Cameron, and I don't want to focus too much on this, but I think it is quite important. He had a seriously disabled young son, and I think you have to give some level of respect to the fact that he balanced out this incredibly pressurizing job with the very demanding job of looking after a severely disabled young child. That young lad tragically died early on in his premiership. On a personal level, though, I think Cameron has shown toughness. I think he has shown he has been statesmanlike on numerous occasions. On other times, not so much. Some of his sort of schoolboy jibes in the Commons are not very statesmanlike, but I think Cameron has always handled pressure in a very calm way, and the whole concept of Cameron chillaxing, some denigrate him for that. I think it actually demonstrates a man who's very much in charge and actually enjoys the job that he's doing. Some prime ministers give the impression that they're miserable in the job. I think to be a number 10 with the pressure that it involves, you have to enjoy it. David Cameron, in summary, I believe is a man who deeply loves his country. I have some very fundamental differences of view, and there's many areas that I have found unforgivable about some of the things his government has done. And given that he is the leader of his party, he is automatically tied to that. There has been, for example, scapegoating of some of the most vulnerable in society, which is unforgivable. Tory billboards, for example, slandering the unemployed. In other major issues, this government has been woefully out of touch on the phone hacking scandal, on bank bonuses, on those issues. The government done too little, too late, and they gave the impression, for right or wrong, it was the impression that they were on the side of, you know, the big powerful figures like the Murdoch press and the big banks, although they would of course contradict that. Um, there's simply too much to say on one video about an entire premiership. 6 years is a long time in politics. In the actual scheme of things, Cameron ranks between Clement Attlee and Lord Russell, which is slightly above average, 6 years, 63 days. Um, that's sort of around average, a little bit above. I believe he ranks 22nd in terms of longevity in the office. He is also one of the youngest prime ministers to retire. I believe the youngest is Lord Rosebery over 100 years ago. Out of 10, altogether, with everything in mind, I give David Cameron. I need to think about this carefully. I'm going to say 5.8 out of 10. He has been strong in some areas, but in other areas, the country has got a lot more divided, and it's very difficult to say today that Britain isn't a very uncertain country because it is. And he has to take some of the responsibility for that. Cameron's Britain has been a very divided Britain, and there's no escaping that fact. And it is a very uncertain Britain as well. Um, but it wouldn't be fair to blame that all on one man. It's collective responsibility. So I'll leave it there. That is my views of the Cameron years. Now, what the May years are going to be like remains to be seen. Very, very soon, Theresa May will go to the palace and officially become Prime Minister. David Cameron will go to the palace to tender his resignation. So let me know your thoughts. That is my summary of David Cameron, the 53rd Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.